Thank you, Chair and members of the board. We have 4 types of property taxes that are under the direction of the Board of Supervisors, sitting as the Board of Directors for various special taxing districts. So we have our general fund, which is our primary property tax levy. Again, going back to those charts of our revenue sources, that goes into the general fund and can be used for any government purpose. We also have the Public Health Services District, which is a secondary property tax. The Flood Control District, also a secondary, and then the Library District, which is a secondary. Today, we're going to specifically cover the first 3.
So just real quick, I also noted the jail district, but that one is set by voter initiative, correct?
Sales tax, yes, is a sales tax.
Yeah,
yes.
thank you, as a sales tax. So I'm sorry I noted that previous. I just was brainstorming all of our various districts. That is a sales tax. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so specifically, we're going to talk about the first 3 today. We do have the city coming in for a library district presentation later in the process. And so we don't want to focus on the library district in advance of that discussion because they will provide some options to you as part of that presentation that they provide. So why this is important. This is a really telling graph. This is the current fiscal year that we're in. Every county in Arizona, you can see off to the very far left in red, Coconino County. We have the lowest primary property tax rate of any county in Arizona. There's a lot of history that goes into that. But the long story short is that we are now locked into having that lowest property tax rate in Arizona, even when we do what's called our truth in taxation hearing and we increase our property tax levy by 2%, that rate continues to go down. And I'll explain that in some subsequent slides. But you can see also the factor by which we are the lowest. If you go way over to the right, the Santa Cruzes, the Gilas, the Pimas, that's a factor of 8 times higher. So we get about $11 million of county property tax for the general fund. So if we had a rate, commensurate with Pima, we would get 88 million. Think of all the things we could do. So it's just important to note that, because one thing that often comes up when we talk about property taxes is, yes, but the cost of living, yes, but the cost of housing. But I don't know that you can multiply that by a factor of 8 reasonably. So ours is low even when we make an adjustment of, say, 10% or 20% for our cost of housing. That still doesn't get us even close to the average. So then we also have the secondary rates that we talked about. So the library district, the flood control district, and the public health services district. When we add those in for all of the counties, that's our next slide. You'll note that arrow kind of starts about the same place that the Pima rate, all told, starts, and you can see we move into 3rd place. But again, that big gap, between if we were on the other end of the rate scale compared to where we are now, our resources from property taxes are very low compared to other counties and how other counties are taxed through property taxes. So one of the things in the general fund tenure, one of the things that is an underlying long-term assumption that we have in our general fund that has been very important to the general fund and to the public health services fund, for that matter, is that we increase our tax levy by doing a truth in taxation hearing. In the general fund, every year we're allowed to increase our tax levy by 2% on properties that were on the tax roll the prior year. For our secondary districts, we also have to do a truth in taxation hearing if we don't change our tax rate, but values increase. So what you see on the screen is just an example of a truth in taxation hearing notice. In order for this recommendation to proceed, after these meetings wrap, we have to do a series of legal notices. But what is not logical that I want to point out in this is that you can see the tax rates off to the right. We have to do this truth in taxation hearing saying this is a notice of a tax increase. Off to the right, the primary property tax rate in fiscal year 24 was 50 cents. In 25, after doing this notice of the tax increase, the tax rate was 49 cents. If we do this property tax notice of tax increase, this truth in taxation hearing this year, which is what is recommended, our rate will be 48 cents. Now, this is algebra, so we're going to go into it in the next one as to why. But if we think about it, the levy can increase by 2%. Values generally, without any new construction or additions to a property, can increase up to 5%. So when values increase by more than 2%, and we want to increase our levy by 2%, the rate gets driven down. It's just the rate times the value is the levy. So that's why the rate is going down, even though it's technically a tax increase. So here we see it visually for the general fund on the screen. So for fiscal year 25, and I have 26 is recommended. Obviously, we haven't had the hearings, but this is the recommendation. So the tax rate right now, 49 cents, recommended for fiscal year 26 is our maximum allowable rate of 48 cents. When we look at our assessed values, so this is the limited property value. That's also an important distinction. Properties are taxed on their limited property value, not on their full tax or their market value. There is a gap between the limited value and the full tax value. It's less than 80% even. So that means the starting point by which a property is taxed is about 80% of the full cash value or the market value just from the start this year. But that's what is in that assessed value is the taxable value. Then we also have new construction. Well, we can see that those assessed values went up on average 4.4%. So in order for a 2% levy increase on those same properties, we would have to decrease our rate. And that's where that 2.3% comes in. Those are rounded numbers. And then we also had new construction. So we're able to tax new construction separately, but you'll notice if that new construction had been added to the roll last year, we would tax it at a rate of 49 cents. This year it's down to 48. So you can see our $11 million property tax levy, an increase to the general fund of only $368,000, again, on that $100 million budget. But it's a very important $368,000 because it's consistent, it's stable, and it's something that we can reasonably forecast. Again, as the lowest rate, it's really hard to recommend anything other than the full allowable property tax levy in the general fund. It can be used for any county purpose. The rate will decrease 2.3% on this recommendation. And the median impact, so this is important, the median impact was provided to us based on the average limited property or taxable value for the fiscal year 26 budget from the assessor's office. So that means if we were to do this tax increase through the truth and taxation process, the typical taxpayer or the median taxpayer in a residential property would have a $2.10 increase on their taxes. Okay. And this is part of the balanced budget recommendation is that we move forward with our recommendation. Any questions on the general fund before I move on to the next taxing district?
Yeah, I'm going to ask for you to make it very clear, and I think it's important for the public to understand if in fact we do not assert our tax levy, it actually, and we decide, oh, this is a bad year, we're not going to do a levy, we're going to wait a year, that actually has a compounding effect in future years, in future abilities on setting our property tax rate. And I think that's really important to go through so people understand that.
Yes, thank you, Chair. That's a really great point. And so not only does the compounding effect, so if it weren't to be taken this year and then say the board still had the authority to do it next year, then there's the compounding impact on the taxpayers as well, because that $2.10 now goes up to $4 or $5, and they're seeing a larger jump versus a gradual year over year incremental increase, assuming we wouldn't get that authority swept. And that's a big assumption because as we look at how did we get to where we are, we've been very conservative with our property tax rates. And we've held back on capacity that we've had in the past saying, we don't need it yet. We're going to wait until we need it and kind of keep that in our back pocket as an organization, knowing we had that taxing authority. Well, what happened was, I don't know, Andy, if you remember 2007, 2006, something like that. The state came in and said, well, you're not using it, so you don't need it. And so they froze us, even though we were closer to this median at the time of what we had the authority to do. They said, well, since you're not using it, we're going to take that authority away from you and you no longer have it and you're locked into this really low rate. So by being very conservative, being responsible to our taxpayers and holding off until, that capacity was needed, it was taken from us and frozen. While that's not currently what happens year over year, there's nothing to stop it from happening again.
And Siri, thank you for that point. And it wasn't frozen by the state coming in and saying, well, here's the rate maximum in which you can assess. It's frozen by county. And so because Coconino County has been so fiscally conservative, we were frozen at clearly the lowest rate in the entire state. Just based on how that was implemented. We have met with Arizona Tax Research. Well, we meet with them every year, Arizona Tax Research Association. And really their overall philosophy has been, well, if you're not using the funds, then you don't need to assess the rate. I think when ATRA looks at our financial planning model, I don't want to boast and say they're impressed, but they understand our model and are accepting of it and understand how we conduct our business here in Coconino County. That's been my experience with them.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm having a hard time following this because it says in the truth and taxation, we're increasing, and then on the right, we're actually decreasing. And, you know, that's actually a good thing for our county residents. I don't know if it's a good thing for the county budget, but it just seems counterintuitive because we're talking about the increase of tax, and yet for some reason the formula is showing that it ends up actually decreasing. And so I was just wondering if you could clarify that a little bit,
Vice
please.
Chair Vasquez, Siri and I both. So the truth and taxation language is specifically outlined in statute, if I remember correctly. And so if we're collecting $1 more than what we've collected in the previous year, then we are to announce that we are increasing taxes. And that's how the language is written in statute.
I think what he's getting at, and correct me if I'm wrong, Supervisor Vasquez, is that we might increase, but we're increasing a smaller limited market value. And so that's why the number actually goes down.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So if we think of how do we come up with our tax levy, the taxes we collect, this is actually saying that we're going to collect more taxes, is why it's a notice of tax increase. But if we think of how we get there, it's the assessed value of our properties times the tax rate. And so if we had no change whatsoever in our values, then our rate could stay the same and it wouldn't be a tax increase. Our rate would go up to have the 2% tax increase. But values are actually going up more. So values have gone up. If values went up 2%, our rate would stay the same and we would still have to do this because we're collecting more in a levy. The values have actually gone up 4.3 or 4.4%. And so then that drives the rate down because we're still getting to the same, factor at the end of doing the multiplication steps. So it's confusing. And that's why we put it up here, because it's not logical, right? It's hard to explain. It's a tax increase, it's a rate decrease. What is it? Yeah, so great questions. It's
So just so I'm repeating, so I clarify,
Yeah.
the endpoint's the same, but because of the way the formula works, we decrease to make sure that the endpoint's the same in the formula.
You got it.
And
Yep.
Siri, and Siri, possibly, because can you go back to the truth and taxation? So that's required of us to post. It's possible that we could do a supplemental to say our tax rate's actually decreasing as part of this. There's a posting requirement, and then we can do a supplement.
Because I think that's important for the public to know.
Yes, it has. I think I want to say we were at 60 cents at one point back when we were
Yeah, in 2005.
Yeah.
2006.
the good old days of 60 cents. Oh. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the Public Health Services District. So this is our next one that we have a recommendation again. It's part of the balanced budget outlook. This is a secondary tax that's used for county health services. The rate on this is 25 cents. That is the maximum allowable rate by statute. That has been the rate since we've had this district in place. So we've never done a rate change on this. But again, and we're at our maximum. So, but again, because values, so you'll note assessed values are going up or have gone up 4.4%. That's assessed values on properties that were on the tax roll this year and next year, 4.4% increase in value. So that means there's a 4.4% increase in the tax levy because we're not changing the other side of that equation, the rate, and the recommendation is to keep the rate the same. and just capture the increased tax revenue on the valuation change. And then we also, again, have the new construction element that we separated out. So overall, there's actually recommended to be a 5.7% increase in this levy because we are accounting for that new construction, which is $326,000. So again, on a levy of right now $5.7 million, you can see the numbers there. Again, this is part of the balanced budget to maintain this current rate. Our outlook is and has been that we keep the rate flat at the 25 cents. For an average, so that median impact, $2.65.
And Siri, could this, and the difference between the 6 million and the 5.7, could that then be utilized to offset any funding freeze impacts from the federal government for health and human service type activities?
Thank you, Andy. Yes. So it is restricted for any health and human services type
Yeah.
activities. And I don't know.
So, and Kim has a lot of experience managing this fund. So.
It's also part of our kind of our assumption over time. We know the difference between the full cash or market value and the limited taxable property value. We know that, values are going to generally go up for at least for the next 3 or so years because there is that gap between the limited and the full cash. And so we do assume that that's going to happen, and it is part of our balanced budget outlook.
Supervisor Fowler.
And in addition to, thanks, Madam Chair, to the property secondary tax, we have a maintenance that we also have to contribute to the public health.
That is correct, Supervisor Fowler. So one thing about the Public Health Services District is that it does have the property tax. It also has the maintenance of effort payment from the general fund. So about 3.8 million, I believe, of general fund dollars on an annual basis that we contribute to the Public Health Services District. But also under this, when we think of the district more broadly, it includes a lot of federal dollars. The district itself isn't just the operating or the taxing fund, but it is the federal and the state pass-through dollars for a variety of health services. So the district itself is pretty large, but it does receive back some backfill funding as well from the general fund.
So let me make sure I understand, because this is an area I think we're all worried about, is that the change is 5.7% increase in dollars. And so I think what I'm hearing is that 5.7% increase in the dollars could be used to cover what could be lost, could be lost in the federal funding.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It is for any health services. So yes, it could be used to cover that. Although because it was also part of the budget assumption, if we were to divert those resources, if you will, to a lost federal source, then the district itself is also short to keep the district itself whole. And then it would be a conversation of, do additional general funds come in? Does the district have to look at budget reductions? I don't know, Kim, if you have other.
No, thanks, Siri. I was just going to say it's not as simple as, okay, there's an additional $326,000 because the district itself has, even from the onset of creating the district, never achieved the full funding of the existing services that were in place at the time. And so when you look at the other increases just to the cost of doing business and to providing those services. So it provides capacity, which is very important, but I just don't want to give a false sense of that it's going to cover something that then gets cut, because there's still going to be that gap.
And with that would be my assumption as well. And with that, is there a reason that there is not a recommendation to, and I'm not suggesting we should do it, but I'm asking you, why are you recommending for no change?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So on this one, we would love to recommend a change. Unfortunately, by statute, the maximum rate is 25 cents. Yep. But if there was ever an area for advocacy, this would be one to, potentially look at. Could we get that statute changed? The maximum rate varies by special taxing district. We're going to move on to flood control in a minute, but flood control has a maximum tax rate of 50 cents, for example. So it's not like there's a bunch of consistency here. So that would be a place where we could look at advocacy. Yep. Okay.
We've lost our government affairs team, but this is something we should we should consider advocating for.
Yes.
They're actually writing advocacy letters right now. So, yeah, not on this, no, on other things, on FEMA, actually. Yeah.
Okay, and then the last one for today, oh, sure.
On here, it says flat maximum allowable rate of 0.25 and slash or $100 average. What's that?
Thank you. So the 25 cents is per $100 of assessed value. And if you are interested in more, to help facilitate this discussion during lunch, I can certainly put together a slide that helps explain this a little bit more. But when we think about how properties are taxed, we talked about the limited value versus the full cash, right? So already about 80%. Well, the rates are per $100 of assessed valuation. But before we even get to that point, we get to do a whole lot of algebra. I love it. Okay, so we start with the value that is then the taxable value. There's an assessment ratio. For a residential property, that assessment ratio is 10%. It's different for commercial property. It's different for vacant land, but we're going to use a residential property because the math is so much easier. So it's 10%. So if you have a property that's valued at $400,000, and then the market value is 400,000, and let's do 500,000. The math is easier. Then we think about 80% of that. So really the taxable limited value might be around $400,000. Then we apply that assessment ratio of 10%. So really our taxable value then goes down to 40,000 on this property that's worth $500,000 so far. So the amount you're taxed at. Well, then the rate is per $100 of value. So then we get to divide by 100 on that. So that takes that 40,000 down to so then $400, right? So the rate is 25 cents times $400 to come up with how much tax you pay versus $500,000 that we started with. So I can come up with something just to kind of walk through all those steps. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Last one, flood control. So just to kind of cut to the chase, we're also not recommending a rate change here because we are at the maximum allowable rate of 50 cents.
We did that last year, didn't we? Didn't we max it 2 years ago? We maxed it out 2 years.
We did. Yep. And so this is countywide also. So all county properties are subject to the flood control district tax. So again, it's a very similar equation or outlook as what we saw with the public health services district, but it is a little bit different because there's different values for flood control versus any other district. Flood control does not have personal property in the assessed valuation. And we can see the new construction is much lower in the flood control district. That's because there's also been changes to how much personal property can be captured. So really new construction reflects the difference between what was on the tax rolls last year and what was on the tax rolls this year. So as personal property has been further removed, new construction goes down because it's just a kind of a plug number there, if you will. And so it looks a little different. There's reasons for it. It's not wrong. It's just different compared to the public health services district. So in this case, it's a 5.5% overall increase in the tax levy, which is $578,000 in this case. Again, the rate is twice as high as the public health services district. So it's a little, larger amount of resources going into the flood control district. This is restricted for the flood control district uses for flood control and also forest restoration. The median impact here for our taxpayers is $5.29. So to pull it all together for those three, we have the rates at the top. So primary, public health service, and flood control. And because the bottom two are not recommending a rate change because they're at their maximum, but the primary is going down, overall, the collective for these three districts is a rate decrease. The net median value. So this is where we were talking about those assessment ratios and things that were happening. So we started with a property of a full cash value of $432,000. Assuming it's a residential property with a 10% valuation ratio. So you can see the total tax levy for those three districts for a county taxpayer would go from $329 to $339 based on this recommendation. And that is $10.04 or overall like an average of 3%. Now another, caution on this, and I don't know if the assessor's office is on here, but every property is different. Some properties have valuation increases, some have decreases depending on where they're located. And the assessor's office does a great job of looking at various markets. It's not, just a collective applied across the county. So every property can be different. And then properties that had, new construction of some sort. So if, there was an expansion to a property, that's new construction, that's separate from this. Or, if there was something that was taken off the rolls for some reason as well, that would be a decrease. Okay, so yes, if Casey, just raise your hand if you want to correct anything I said. Okay, so with that, we just to wrap up here before there's discussion, the process for this, the reason we went through these things is that once we wrap up the budget discussions, we have a series of legal requirements, legal notices in order to proceed with this recommendation. We have to hold the truth and taxation hearing. So that is scheduled for June 24th. So leading up to that, we have to notify the public. We have to put some things on the website. We have to put some things in the paper. So I don't want anyone to be surprised if they see the truth and taxation notices going out. We're always happy to field questions if you have any as well from taxpayers. Also, the vote on each of these is a roll call vote, meaning every individual supervisor, as you guys have been through this before, we open the truth and taxation hearing, we hear from members of the public, we close the hearing, and then we ask individually your vote on that item. So just a warning again, we have to start the notification processes. So, don't want any surprises there. But with that, we'll turn it over for, any discussion, or we can go back to any slides as well.
Someone had suggested it was either Andy or Siri, or it was someone up here, but when this truth and taxation notice goes out, I personally, I'm just speaking on behalf of myself, but I would like to see that paragraph of explanation, because that goes a long ways. It raises the tax rate, but it doesn't really raise your taxes, so to speak. And I don't know, I remember watching Schoolhouse Rock when I was growing up, and they took something really complicated and they boiled it down, they distilled it to where it was understandable. So I would like it to be really understandable for all of the taxpayers out there, because this is complicated. And like Supervisor Vasquez said, it's counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense. And so if we can make sense of this, I think it's going to go a long ways to fielding phone calls that are going to be coming into our offices, getting ahead of it if we can.
Thank you. And one thing I should also note, Supervisor and members of the board, is that this is not actually a statute that's unique to counties. So around that time of year, you'll also start to see these notices for the city of Flagstaff, the community college. And so there are other taxing entities as well. And we have been at the forefront of having that explanation in the past. It's a separate paid advertisement that we ask for, to accompany it to help. In which case, then we have full flexibility. We still have to have the 4th page legal notice exactly as prescribed by statute, but we can supplement with that explanation.
And to add to all that confusion, we also are a pass-through for the school districts, for the fire department. That gets all muddled up in this conversation, and we're there trying to separate all of that and say, no, that one is just going through. We don't even take administrative costs. It just flows right on through like water running through a tube. And it's like, okay, I still don't understand what you're talking about. I think just the explanation of all of that is just clearly is really would be important. But through the years, I think we've learned how to, well, anyway, those that have been here learn how to explain it all.
And thank you for that. And that is a great point. And we see that when we do the tax rate setting in August as well. As the county treasurer, one of their statutory requirements for Treasurer Benefitar is to collect taxes on behalf of all of the taxing jurisdictions. And so they'll get what looks like a county treasurer's tax bill. But in reality, a very small amount of that money actually stays with the county, and most of it does go to school districts, is by and large the largest piece of that distribution pie on a tax bill. And also just one more, that the county board is required to set. We didn't talk about it because there is no option other than to set the rate, is the fire district assistance tax. It's a 10-cent rate. It gets distributed to the fire districts. It's all driven by statute. Unfortunately, it's a rubber stamp kind of requirement that does get folded into the truth and taxation process. But there is no option for the board, other than to adopt that tax as well.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor Fowler makes a really good point, is because in District 3, 7 of the 11 fire districts are in District 3. They can independently on their own raise theirs, but it looks like the tax rate is actually going higher. So do you guys do any kind of clarifying language in what you put out there so people know that as well? I get, and maybe I'm not the only district with a fire district in it.
Mhm.
But as those go up, District 3 could potentially have the worst impact.
Sure. Yes, thank you, Supervisor. And I'm not sure if Treasurer Benatar is on here and wants to speak to, what goes out with the tax notices. But in the past, we've also provided a link and a website as well that, has contact information. So for questions about changes to your taxes for this fire district or for this school district, and provided the contact information for those districts. And we also do that as part of the tax rate adoption process that's done collaboratively between the treasurer's office, the assessor's office, the finance department. We, and the superintendent of schools office as well, we look at where are those areas where we might get phone calls because the levy is increasing more than just, maybe the 2%, or, if someone's doing a large rate increase or a big change. And we also try to proactively notify the board. So, have, at the ready this district and here's their explanation for why. But really, we want those questions to go to those districts. So yes, we do provide those resources.